Welcome back to another video on Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties in China. Some of you may have been wondering what that was. That was a water-powered clock that was created during the Song dynasty, and it was one of the first instances where humans were trying to take control over and master time. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching the last video are these first two. They are CCOT questions, asking about the continuities and changes over time in cultural traditions in China, and also in political traditions. So after watching this video, you should be able to answer this question about what innovations were developed in China during the Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties, and how did those innovations spread? And then this question, in what ways did China exert influence on the other regions of East Asia? What innovations were developed in China during the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties? And then how did those innovations eventually spread? So many of the great intellectual achievements of this period 3 came out of both the Islamic caliphates, as we've talked about before, and also Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties in China. And in China, it was really the rulers who promoted the creation of many of these innovations as a way of demonstrating and maintaining their power and legitimacy. Some other major innovations in this period, one was a large public infrastructure project, which was used to connect the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, so the Yellow River in northern China and the Yangtze in southern China. There was a need, because a lot of the farmland is actually in southern China, to transport food to the north, and so they developed this Grand Canal, which was started during the Sui dynasty and later picked up in the Tang and Song. And so what effect did this Grand Canal have? Well, it's going to increase within China intra-regional trade and transportation. So it performs a very similar function to the great Roman roads that we discussed before, and we'll also mention later the Incan road system. But whenever you're talking about a large public infrastructure project like this, remember the Great Wall, it requires lots of labor and lots of taxes. So we talked before about corvée labor, this labor where the state imposes a substitution for a tax, or in addition to a tax, you're required to work for usually 1 or 2 months out of the year on these large public infrastructure projects. That was how China was able to create and build these massive projects. And it's still widely used today. Fast ripening varieties of rice known as champa rice were imported from Vietnam. And so this allowed the Chinese, instead of growing rice and harvesting rice one crop per season, they were able to get 2 crops in. So they were able to plant the rice and then harvest, and then plant again and harvest in one season. So that essentially doubled their agricultural output. They also developed innovations in the horse collar, which allowed them to harness the energy of horses and gave them more effective use of plows. They also developed terrace farming systems. So in elevated regions with hills and mountains, they would cut into the side of the mountain and then grow on top of these terraces, and it was a very effective way at growing crops at elevation. So these innovations are going to increase agricultural production, and whenever you're talking about more food, the natural effect of that is greater population. So during the Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties, China's population really begins to take off and grow exponentially as a result of these innovations in agriculture. Another innovation during this time period that the Chinese actually stumbled upon was gunpowder. These Chinese alchemists were messing with different chemicals, and they were heating together sulfur with honey, and they found that smoke and flames resulted, so that their hands and faces have been burnt, and even their whole house where they were working was burnt down. That's from a Chinese alchemist's text. And so they basically stumbled upon gunpowder, which is going to become very critical as it's going to spread by way of the Mongols across Eurasia, eventually making its way into Europe. They also developed the movable type printing press. So because there are thousands of individual Chinese characters, they found that it was far more efficient to create printing press system. And so the Chinese developed the first movable type printing press and utilized it for text, such as this Buddhist manuscript gunpowder and the printing press are eventually going to spread east and are going to eventually become very critical in the development of Europe later on in history. Two more items that were developed during the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. This here is a piece of paper, so they developed paper currency. But paper currency is only good if the government is actually backing and supporting that currency, and so they realized that this was a far more effective system than having metal currency, which is incredibly heavy and hard to move. The one drawback to this is it's really easy for the government to just print more paper money, and we're going to see some societies that are going to experience problems with inflation. This innovation here, they had developed a magnetic compass and they started using it for maritime purposes. So they put it on boats and they were able to travel out further into the ocean, which was a critical thing that the compass allowed sailors to do, was to begin to travel out into the open water without having to stay next to the shore, which made their trips and routes far more efficient and effective. In what ways did China exert influence on other regions of East Asia? So one way to think about this is China is basically like the sun of East Asia. And Korea, Japan, Vietnam, which is in Southeast Asia, are essentially like the planets that are orbiting around the Chinese sun. I mean, the China has such a strong gravitational pull. And so China really had this huge political, economic, cultural influence on Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And this really came to a head during the Tang Dynasty, when the Japanese and the Koreans sent delegations of scholars to China to study what the Chinese were doing and then to bring back those traditions to Korea and Japan, which is what happened. So, for example, the Japanese are going to adopt Confucianism and Buddhism and Chinese-style bureaucracy. They're going to drink tea like the Chinese. They're going to wear silks like the Chinese. They're going to have writing that's very similar to Chinese characters. That's the massive gravitational influence the Chinese has on other regions in East Asia. That being said, they still maintain some of their own local traditions and customs. So for example, the Japanese practice this native animistic type of religion called Shintoism. It's heavy into nature, spirits. Many of these temples, which are shaped like this, are found out in beautiful places in nature, in the countryside, on a mountain or in a lake. And they worship their spirits of their dead ancestors. There's ancestor veneration as well. And so many Japanese continue to practice Shintoism at the same time that Confucianism and Buddhism and some of those Chinese traditions are being brought into Japan. So we can see that in some respects, the Japanese are embracing Chinese traditions and customs, but in other ways, they are retaining some of their own local traditions. So the Chinese had these great innovations, and other people were looking to them as a model. And so the Chinese had a sense of superiority, and they required their neighbors to engage in what's known as the tribute system. So in order to trade with China, these diplomats from neighboring states had to recognize Chinese superiority. And the way they did this was by going to the royal court in China and by kowtowing in front of the emperor. Now when you kowtow, you bow down with one's head touching the ground as a sign of submission to the superior Chinese. So the Chinese required this for anyone who wanted to trade with them, including the northern nomadic peoples. So as a result of watching these two videos, you should be able to answer these questions. In what ways did the cultural traditions of China change during the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties? In what ways did they stay the same? In what ways did the political traditions of China change during the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties? And in what ways did they stay the same? What innovations were developed in China during the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties? And then how did those innovations eventually spread? And then in what ways did China exert influence on other regions of East Asia? Thanks for watching.